All right. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Historically Speaking. This episode is well timed, if I do say so myself, because the Leadership Selection Team, Leadership Selection Committee, LSC, is just beginning their all-important work of kicking off the nominations and elections process ahead of Kappa's convention in June 2026. It's a fairly new process. It was requested by the membership at the 2022 convention. And for the second time, the first one was in 2024, it will be completed entirely online using a third-party vendor to ensure both security and impartiality in compiling the votes to determine who will serve in Kappa's highest leadership positions for the next biennium between 2026 and 2028. And I should introduce ourselves. I'm Kylie Smith, the Archivist and Museum Director for Kappa, and I am joined by Denise Rugani, our Ritual and History Director, former fraternity president, all around Kappa gal.
Thank you. So, and even though it feels like we just got home from the 2024 convention, these things take time. And while we don't know who will be installed as president in 2026, we do know who served Kappa in the earliest years of the organization. Last year, we covered the second group of presidents, from Lucy Evelyn Wright Allen, who was installed in 1890, to Jean Nelson Penfield, who was elected in 1900. We called them the second class. So here we are with the third class, starting with one of my favorites.
May Cynthia Whiting Westerman, who initiated at Sigma chapter at the University of Nebraska in 1892, is a favorite for all of us. May Westerman is the only Kappa to have served 3 terms as president, first as Grand President from 1902 to 1904, which is what we'll be covering tonight. And spoiler alert, next, she served as the first national president from 1922 until 1926. Her name is on the charters of 8 chapters and on the membership certificates of approximately 3,000 Kappas.
We should note that May was the first and one of only 2 national presidents. She and Georgia Hayden Lloyd Jones served as national presidents before the title reverted to Grand again. But perhaps most notable of all, May Whiting Westerman researched and edited the long-awaited history of Kappa Kappa Gamma from 1870 to 1930 during her tenure as fraternity historian. It is my most favorite literature. In a convention toast in 1932, when the book was released 2 years after her deadline goal, she famously said, "Buy the history, read the history, never write a history."
May was a sweet-faced woman with a commanding presence who embodied the ideals of Kappa in courage, mentality, honesty, and vision. And she had a head for detail. She was initiated in 1892 and attended her first convention as a speaker in 1896. And talk about a quick trajectory. She then served as assistant marshal in 1898, which in today's terms is assistant convention chair. Everyone must have been able to sense May's abilities because she was appointed deputy to the Grand Treasurer at that 1898 convention. She held that office until the 1900 convention in Columbus, Ohio, when she was elected Grand Secretary.
And her rise in the ranks didn't stop there. When the Grand Council met in July 1901 in Buffalo, New York, Grand President Jean Nelson Penfield was ill, leaving May to preside over private business sessions, including discussions of what has come to be known as the Beta Beta debacle. We'll save that one for another episode. The following year, in 1902, she was elected Grand President and was married a month later. So let's recap that timeline. She was initiated at 18 years old. When she was 22, she was a speaker at convention, assistant marshal, and then deputy to the Grand Treasurer at 24 years old. She was elected Grand Secretary at 26 and functioning as Grand President at 27.
When I was 27, I was planning happy hours with friends and trying to find an apartment that I could afford. I was definitely not running a national organization with 6,000 members and chapters on 28 college or university campuses. And this is one of my favorite bits of trivia for May. At the end of her first term as president in 1904, her council gave her a gavel that has been left to the fraternity. It has been used at every chapter installation and to open and close every Kappa convention since 1966. And despite her long service over the years, May is proof that you can take a break from volunteering and come back later. At the end of her term as president in 1904, she was appointed historian, but resigned in 1905, and she did no Kappa work for 13 years. Though I kind of don't believe that. I feel like she was probably in her head at least doing a little bit of Kappa work. And now we actually had lots more about May to talk about, but I forgot that that's actually for another episode since she only served one term as Grand President from 1902 to 1904. She does come back later, and it's a remarkable comeback.
You're right. May really was remarkable, but we'll save the rest of the story for another episode. Sadly, there's not a whole lot written about May's successor, our next president, Elmy Warner Mallory, who was initiated at Lambda chapter at the University of Akron in 1893. Her first name was Lydia, but everyone knew her as Elmy. She was described as tall, beautiful, energetic, and compassionate. She became president after May Westerman's first term and served from 1904 to 1906. She was elected at the convention hosted by Theta chapter at Columbia in Missouri and presided at the 1906 convention hosted by Eta chapter at Madison, Wisconsin. Before becoming president, Elmy was a province convention delegate in 1895, a national convention delegate in 1896, and grand registrar from 1900 until 1904.
During her term as president, Elmy tried to gauge university sentiment toward fraternities by carrying out extensive correspondence with the deans of women and college presidents. Opinions of Kappa ran the gamut. Get this. One school official complained about Kappa members, quote, strolling out of doors with men late on summer evenings. Elmy pressed for alumna organization and was conservative on extension. She chose not to pursue big expansion efforts onto new campuses.
He wrote that rushing with its accompanying festivities and rapidly formed friendships is one of the greatest evils of fraternity life, she said, urging that honor, scholarship, sincerity, and conservatively formed friendships be our watchwords. In college, Elmy was known as a singer and public speaker. After her term as Grand President, she became alumni officer from 1906 to 1908, chairing a committee to organize alumna efforts, which was a forerunner to the director of alumnus.
She was a busy Kappa, but goodness, outside of her Kappa activities, she was even busier. She went on to become an editor and reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a child psychology columnist for the Detroit News. And that's not all. She also worked as a psychiatric social worker. She was a respected child guidance leader and was the owner and director of a nursery school, and in general was known for her roles as teacher, lecturer, and author.
Elmy had two children, and her daughter Cynthia became a member of the Beta Delta chapter at the University of Michigan when she was just 13. Cynthia was the youngest student on the Michigan campus, and she is believed to be the youngest Kappa ever pledged. Although in the early days of the fraternity, pre-college students were sometimes pledged secretly. When Cynthia was pledged and then initiated at Beta Delta, Elmy was also an advisor to the chapter. Contemporaries wrote of Elmy Mallory that she was a joy to behold and a joy to know, a kindly, gentle, generous personality.
There seems to be a running theme with these Kappa leaders, so I shouldn't be surprised that I really wish I had the opportunity to know each of them personally. Our next president in this group is Mary Griffith Canby, who initiated at Beta Alpha chapter at the University of Pennsylvania in 1892. When she was elected, she was not yet married, so she was known as Mary Griffith. She served from 1906 to 1908, and she was a mathematician, physicist, and botanist. And talk about a pioneer. When she entered the University of Pennsylvania in 1891 to study physics, she was one of only 20 women in the field among thousands of men. She was the first woman in the country to have her hand x-rayed. It was a 2-hour exposure for a display for the American Philosophical Society. When she was elected Grand President, the Kappas of Beta Alpha chapter held the reception in Houston Hall, which was the men's clubhouse on campus, which was another first for women.
In the middle of her term as Grand President, she married and moved to Oregon with her husband, Will Canby. When she was to take charge of a gold mining site, she remembered great masses of wild irises in full bloom on the mountain where she honeymooned and said it was a true Kappa welcome. While there, her mail was delivered by mule up a narrow, steep mountain trail. The postmaster, whose sister was a Kappa, thought should be delivered promptly because Mary was president. Talk about networking. Mary returned to Pennsylvania for the 1908 convention to preside.
In these pictures, they started to kind of blur together for me. I see that I have the red circle around the wrong person. Mary Canby is actually just to the right of where that red circle is. So I'll fix that for the recording. But before her presidency, Mary had served the Grand Council for 8 years as a deputy or officer and had visited many chapters. During her term as president, it was decided that the editor of the Key would no longer be a member of council. Beta Upsilon chapter at the University of West Virginia was installed, and the Grand Secretary, George Challoner Tracy, had resigned. So Mary took over that work as well, having served in that office for 4 years. So she was essentially the president and the secretary at the same time. She attended to details, advocated for a late pledge day, made radical changes in rushing techniques, and believed that an invitation to membership should be considered a real honor.
After her term, she returned to Grants Pass, Oregon, where she was active in several groups, including the PTA, even though she had no children. In 1909, she went to Montana to install the new chapter, Beta Phi, at the University of Montana in Missoula. She brought with her 17 badges made of Montana nugget gold for the charter members, and we have one of them on display at the fraternity headquarters. Mary Griffin Canby once said that 15 years of fraternity life have left their impression on me. I believe heart and soul in the fraternity.
And our sisterhood is better for it. Next up is Edith Stoner Robinson, who was initiated at Theta chapter at the University of Missouri in 1902, who is celebrating their 150th anniversary. When elected, she was not yet married and known as Edith Stoner. By that time, when Edith served as Grand President from 1908 to 1910, Grand Council members were no longer young women in or just out of college. She had made a good impression at the 1904 convention when her chapter, Theta, hosted the convention in Columbia, Missouri, at the same time the World's Fair was taking place in St. Louis. She then attended the 1906 convention as a delegate of the Kansas City Alumni Association, and there she was elected Grand Registrar.
Shortly before the 1908 convention, she was appointed Grand Secretary and likely had to train herself since the previous two secretaries had resigned. Her hard work and great skill was noticed again, and at the 1908 convention, she was unanimously elected Grand President. During her second year in office, Edith took a leave of absence from teaching high school chemistry to make a business of being Grand President, during which time she visited many chapters. In her 1910 address, she said problems with coeducation had to be faced and could be solved with chapter house rules, improved scholarship, and stronger Panhellenic arrangements.
One of our participants tonight is Dr. Oz, director of the Stewart House Museum. And you might remember this, Dr. Oz, when we read in Key Matters in a magazine, something that Edith Stoner had suggested. It was a system that had been set up in which a Kappa who was not doing well scholastically would be contacted by a committee member who wrote a, quote, sympathetic letter of inquiry. She felt poor work was not due to inability or lack of interest, but to things happening in their lives outside of Kappa and school. She implored undergraduates not to let their social lives take precedence over academic achievement.
She felt Panhellenic cooperation could solve some of the problems of rushing and pledging. At the 7th Inter-Sorority Conference held immediately after her election, Edith was chosen secretary. As one of the committee of 3, she helped draw up a letter to alumni groups of the 12 women's fraternities, informing them of ways they could be of real service. Having written 1,500 letters as fraternity president and more as secretary of the Panhellenic Conference, Edith lobbied for the grand president and grand secretary to have their own secretaries. She suggested the annual tax be raised from $3 to $5 so a secretary could be hired at up to $30 a month. This would start Kappa on the path to hiring full-time staff members and set up a central office. And talk about a Kappa family. 12 years after her term, Edith, who had 2 Kappa sisters, married and had a daughter, who became a member of Pi Deuteron chapter, UC Berkeley.
So real quick, Denise, she wrote 1,500 letters as fraternity president. How many do you think you wrote as fraternity president? 1,500?
I did. Luckily, we had email.
Yeah, that's true.
Could be a sentence here or there.
Right. So many of these biographies feel shorter because so many of these early Kappa leaders only served for one term as Grand President, but they did a lot in those terms. However, it made it harder to find photographs of them in the archives. In fact, from Gene Penfield in 1900 until this next president, six in a row served just one term. Of course, that usually wasn't their only role in Kappa. So next up is Florence Burton Roth, who was initiated at the Beta Delta chapter at the University of Michigan in 1901. Florence was installed as president in 1910 and served until 1912. Since it was Kappa's turn to head the National Panhellenic Congress, which is now known as Conference, she distinguished herself as the NPC president as well.
As an undergraduate, Florence was exuberant and witty and had with a fun sense of humor. Her humor continued throughout her life. At the end of her banquet speech in 1948, she quipped, "The mind can absorb only what the seat can endure." It was under Florence's stewardship that Kappa became an international fraternity when on May 24th, 1911, she installed Kappa Kappa Gamma's first Canadian chapter, Beta Psi, at the University of Toronto.
Florence had served as Grand Secretary before becoming president. After her term, Florence accepted the office of historian, which she held for more than 12 years until 1925. She was the first historian to actually reach the point of planning to publish a history. She wrote the histories of Kappa's early chapters and collected much of the material that Mae Westerman would later use. Later, she agreed to be the chairman of the board of trustees of the clubhouse, which was later called the Boyd Hearthstone, which was a vacation home for Kappas in Winter Park, Florida, and she served in that role for nearly 15 years.
Florence married and had a son and was known as a social engineer who built a creative community spirit both at home and in Kappa. At home, she was interested in hospitals, church work, helping orphans and the elderly, war work, and women's clubs. To the end of her life, she was a devoted and admired Kappa.
It's interesting to see how leadership shifted around the country in these early years. We started out, of course, in Illinois and Indiana, then moved between the East Coast and the Midwest for several decades. Our first Grand President from the West Coast was elected in 1912, just 42 years after Kappa's founding. Her name was Eva Powell, and she was initiated at Pi Deuteron chapter at UC Berkeley in 1897.
We love to talk about Kate Sharp being the oldest elected to Grand Council at the ripe old age of 29 in 1894. But Eva Powell wins the award for being the oldest to serve in the role when she was elected in 1912. She was 35 years old. Can you believe it? Eva Powell had represented the Alumni Association near Berkeley at both the 1908 and 1910 convention and was elected Grand Secretary at the 1910 convention. She moved up quickly to Grand President in 1912, and she was reelected in 1914. So after a string of single-term presidents, she served 2 terms over the course of 4 years.
The Berkeley graduate and former chapter president was easily recognized for the long, thick hair she wore in a coronet braid. Let me show you that again. And notable, too, was her support of chapter extension. And during her administration, between 1912 and 1916, Kappa had its greatest number of new chapters in 24 years. They had 3 new chapters and 2 chapters were restarted. Beta Omega at Oregon, Beta Theta at Oklahoma, Beta Kappa at Idaho, those were all installed, and then Beta Rho at Cincinnati and Beta Beta at St. Lawrence were reinstated as Deuteron chapters. And at the time, only Beta Gamma chapter at Worcester College in Ohio was lost because of longtime faculty opposition.
In pushing Kappa to expand and establish chapters on new campuses, she asked, "Have we not become so enamored of the word conservatism that we have allowed other fraternities to go into universities first, where we had the opportunity?" While she was in favor of growing, she also called for careful extension, a notion of quality over quantity. Because of anti-fraternity feelings, she insisted that sororities must increasingly become centers not of exclusiveness, but of truly democratic influences, not of social excesses, but of genuine personal culture, dignity, and character.
And true to those convictions, a scholarship requirement for initiation was added during her terms. Social service work for chapters and the importance of a budget and living on a cash basis were stressed, and the Students' Aid Fund was increased to $10,000. A pledge pin was adopted, Kate Sharp rejoiced, and a songbook was published. A campaign of alumna education was carried on, and an alumni officer was made a regular member of Grand Council and called Grand Vice President. And the province system was expanded to 10 provinces. After 4 years of leading Kappa, the Oakland, California native returned to her other work, which included the presidency of several other civic, church, and women's groups. Twice, she served as president of the San Francisco Bay Alumni Association.
For the League of Women Voters, she organized study groups and national committees. She served the YWCA as general secretary in Denver and in New York. In 1922, she went to South Africa to raise funds for the YWCA. Despite all this activity, she found time to play the piano up to 4 hours a day. And before her death, she said she would be happy if Kappa could be known as a singing fraternity, proud as she was of its songbook.
It would be nice to be a singing fraternity, but I don't know. We just had a couple of music majors in my chapter, and we begged them to solo most of the songs. At any rate, our last feature for tonight's program is Lydia Voorhees Colby, who was initiated at Lambda chapter at Akron University in 1900. It's been written that no one family put in more hours of service to Kappa Kappa Gamma than the mother, aunts, and sisters of Kappa's 15th Grand President, Lydia Voorhees Colby. When she became Grand President in 1916, she was a second-generation Kappa, one of 3 daughters of Elizabeth, known as Lizzie Slade, a charter member of Lambda chapter.
All 3 of Lizzie's daughters were Lambda initiates who went on to hold national office. Lydia was Grand Treasurer, Business Manager of the Key, and Grand President. Elizabeth was Grand President's Deputy, Editor of the Key, and Grand Treasurer. Marion served as Sisters Lydia's deputy. Their dedication to Kappa is not surprising in that their mother, Lizzie, was the first of 5 sisters on Lambda's chapter roll, one of whom, Marion, served nationally as Grand Marshal from 1884 to 1886, when Lydia was just a toddler.
A kindergarten teacher with a BS in home economics, Lydia has been described as indefatigable. Indefatigable. I always mess up that word. In her zeal and earnestness for the fraternity. Building on the growth during Eva Powell's terms, 7 new chapters were established during Lydia Colby's 2 terms as Grand President. Gamma Alpha at Kansas State, Gamma Beta at New Mexico, Gamma Gamma at Whitman, Gamma Delta at Purdue, Gamma Epsilon at Pittsburgh, Gamma Zeta at Arizona, and Gamma Eta at Washington State. A Kappa calendar was printed. A new catalog was also printed, a new catalog custodian was selected. The Students' Aid Fund was increased again, and the Key was published without a deficit. Province vice presidents were instituted to assist the Grand Vice President with alumna matters.
Lydia found the travel part of her presidency a hardship, with night after night spent on trains and at nondescript hotels. But out of loyalty, she and the rest of her council agreed to continue serving in the respected offices from 1918 to 1920, when after World War I had started, and by vote, Kappa held no convention in 1918. The convention of 1920, however, was Kappa's 50th, its golden jubilee, and it was Lydia's convention, at which her proud mother was present to hear Lydia's valedictorian speech address. May the structure of the next 50 years be as strong and beautiful as the first, Lydia said, adding, this can only be accomplished by strict adherence to those policies which have been tested and found invaluable, by an open-mindedness to new ideas and situations, by a loyalty to each other, which excludes jealousness and rancor, and by living according to the ideals of our fraternity.
So I feel like we should just reshare those suggestions to our members today. They are timeless. If we know our ideals, really listen to them when we hear the words of our ritual, then not too much can go wrong.
I was thinking the same thing when I read this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for Loyal Leaders, the third class, as we get to know some of our sisterhood's earliest leaders. We hope you'll all join us next month for a look at Kappa's role in National Panhellenic Conference. And then in June, we're really excited for our last program of the school year, the Stewart House in Bloom, with Dr. Mary Osborne, Dr. Oz, director of the Stewart House Museum. And we will hope to have a special appearance by her dog and big-time heritage fan, Harry.